Hello everyone, in today's video I will be talking about the concept of brothels throughout history and its evolution to the present day. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this. Throughout human history, sexuality has been an area constantly sought to be controlled, defined, and restricted, both at the individual and societal levels. The concept of brothels is one of the most concrete and controversial products of this control effort. Historically, brothels have emerged not only as places where sexual services are offered, but also as areas of control where morality, economics, law, religion, and power relations intersect. Therefore, the history of brothels is not only the history of sexuality, but also the history of how societies regulate themselves. In the oldest civilizations, the concept of brothels was quite different from its modern meaning. In Mesopotamia, especially in Sumerian and Babylonian societies, sexuality was addressed independently of today's moral frameworks. Temples were not only places of worship, but also social and economic centers. In this context, practices called sacred prostitution emerged. Some women participated in sexual rituals in temples, dedicated to the gods. These acts were not considered immoral, they were deemed necessary for fertility, procreation, and the continuation of the divine order. During this period, sexual service was seen not as an individual choice, but as a religious and social duty. The female body was a symbol of fertility and abundance. Brothel-like structures were not hidden or excluded spaces in the modern sense, but institutions at the center of society. This shows that the initial emergence of brothels occurred in a sacred, not an immoral, context. By ancient Greece, the concept of brothels had acquired a more secular character. In Athens, brothels were institutions controlled and taxed by the state. Solon's laws show that brothels were considered part of the city's order. These brothels were cheap and accessible places serving the lower classes of society. Alongside them were hetairas, more educated and socially freer women. Unlike ordinary brothel workers, hetairas were figures who participated in intellectual conversations and were involved in political and artistic circles. This distinction reveals the class dimension of the brothel concept. Sexuality was not regulated in the same way for everyone. Sexuality, a controlled, restricted, and stigmatized area for the lower classes, was made more flexible and invisible for the upper classes. Brothels became the spatial manifestation of this inequality. In the Roman Empire, the concept of brothels became even more institutionalized. Brothels, called lupanar, were concentrated in certain areas of cities. Instead of banning brothels, the Roman state chose to register them. Prostitutes were required to wear special clothing and held certain social statuses. This shows that brothels became institutions that were accepted but not respected. In Rome, brothels were also closely linked to the military and economic order. Controlling the sexual needs of soldiers who were on long campaigns was considered important for maintaining social order. Therefore, brothels were perceived not as structures that disrupted order, but as structures that preserved it. However, this acceptance did not prevent the social exclusion of brothel workers. They were figures that the system needed but did not want to include. With the fall of Rome, the concept of brothels also underwent a major transformation. The rise of Christianity radically changed the view of sexuality. Sexuality was no longer seen as a sacred or natural phenomenon, it began to be viewed as a realm of sin that needed to be controlled. Despite this, brothels did not completely disappear. On the contrary, they continued to exist in various forms throughout the Middle Ages. In medieval Europe, brothels were implicitly tolerated, though not explicitly approved by the Church. Some theologians, such as Saint Augustine, described the existence of brothels as an evil that prevents greater sins. This approach laid the foundation for a hypocritical understanding where brothels were morally rejected but practically necessary. With increasing urbanization, brothels in medieval cities were confined to specific neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were usually located outside the city walls or on the outskirts of the city. This spatial segregation of brothels is an indication of the physical exclusion of sexuality from society. However, this exclusion did not eliminate the function of brothels. On the contrary, it made them more visible and stigmatized. In the Middle Ages, brothels were often operated by municipalities. This situation shows that brothels were not entirely illegal establishments. City administrations collected taxes from brothels, regulated their operating hours, and set certain rules. These rules generally extended from the women's clothing to the behavior of customers. In this sense, the brothel was both a moral and a bureaucratic institution. During this period, brothel workers constituted one of the most vulnerable groups in society. They had limited legal rights and lived a life exposed to violence. Despite this, brothels continued to be seen as essential for the continuity of society. This contradiction is one of the most fundamental characteristics of brothel history, an institution rejected but indispensable. The understanding of brothels began to change again as we moved towards the Renaissance. The human body and desires began to be rethought. However, this change did not eliminate the stigma surrounding brothels. On the contrary, it gave rise to a more complex understanding of morality. Brothels were now both a place of sin and a part of the city's economy. This long historical process clearly shows that brothels were never solely about sexuality. Brothels are concrete spaces where societies control, classify, and manage sexuality. They existed at the intersection of morality, power, and economic interests. As the early modern period dawned, the concept of brothels in Europe was on the verge of major transformations. The Reformation, the fragmentation of religious authority, and the strengthening of centralized states altered the forms of control over sexuality. Martin Luther and other reformers harshly criticized the Catholic Church's tacit tolerance of brothels. Sexuality was no longer seen merely as a sin, but as a social danger that needed to be regulated. This perspective severely undermined the legitimacy of brothels. In the 19th century, brothels were closed or placed under strict control in many European cities. However, these closures did not eliminate brothels, they only drove them underground. Officially forbidden sexuality continued to exist in informal spheres. This reflects a paradox frequently seen in the emergence of the modern state. As the desire to control increased, so did the areas that could not be controlled. During this period, the concept of brothels became more closely linked to health issues. The spread of sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis in Europe brought brothels to the forefront as a medical problem. Instead of closing down brothels, states began to regulate them through health checks. This approach is considered an early example of modern regulation. In the 18th and 19th centuries, brothels were restructured to be compatible with the governing philosophy of absolute monarchies. In France and some German cities, brothels were placed under strict police control. Women were registered, regular examinations were made mandatory, and they were required to work in specific areas. The brothel was no longer just a moral institution, but an administrative one. The state preferred to manage sexuality rather than suppress it. In this process, the class structure of brothels became even more pronounced. While poor women were forced to work in state-controlled brothels, more secret and protected spaces serving the upper classes continued to exist. This shows that the regulation of sexuality has always been far from equitable. Brothels had become the physical manifestation of class differences. The Enlightenment opened up the discussion of the concept of brothels at a theoretical level as well. While some thinkers argued that brothels were a social necessity, others saw them as a source of moral decay. These debates revolved around the question of whether sexuality was an individual freedom or a social threat. Brothels were the concrete ground for this philosophical debate. With the Industrial Revolution, the social role of brothels changed again. Migration from rural areas to cities, the growth of the working class, and the deepening of poverty increased the number of brothels. In large cities, brothels became one of the dark but indispensable elements of the modern metropolis. Sexuality was no longer just a moral issue, it was also an economic one. In the 19th century, the concept of brothels transformed into one of the harshest forms of control over the female body. Victorian morality, while suppressing sexuality in the public sphere, continued to consider brothels as necessary evil. Women were the group that paid the heaviest price for this contradiction. Brothel workers were both morally stigmatized and subjected to strict state control. The moral reform movements that emerged during this period advocated for the closure of brothels. However, these movements often aimed more at maintaining social order than protecting women. The closure of brothels did not improve women's living conditions, on the contrary, it made them even more vulnerable. This situation showed that the brothel issue could not be solved with simple bans. During the colonial era, the concept of brothels gained a global dimension. European states aimed to both maintain military order and control the local population by establishing brothels in their colonies. These brothels were places where racial and cultural hierarchies were sharply enforced. Indigenous women were often forcibly drawn into this system. In this context, the brothel became one of the tools of colonial power. By the 20th century, brothels continued to be central to the moral, health, and security policies of the modern state. While some countries completely banned brothels, others legitimized them with strict regulations. These different approaches reveal that there is no universal solution to the brothel issue. Each society has redefined this institution in accordance with its own values and interests. The concept of brothels has gained a new dimension in the modern era with human rights discussions. Women's rights, bodily autonomy, and the concept of labor have moved the brothel issue from solely a moral axis to the context of social justice. Brothels are no longer debated solely in terms of should they exist or not, but rather how should they be regulated, and who should be protected. This long historical trajectory shows that brothels have never held a fixed meaning. In every era, brothels have been mirrors reflecting society's fears, needs, and contradictions. From sacred ritual to state institution, the brothel, transformed from a place of sin to a tool of health policy, is one of the most complex structures in human history. As the narrative progresses, the legal status of brothels in the modern world will be further explored through feminist debates, global inequalities, and the understanding of sexuality in the digital age. The future of brothels is not independent of their past, on the contrary, it still carries that long historical burden. While the concept of brothels in the Middle Ages was outwardly surrounded by moral rejection, in practice it possessed a highly systematic and institutional structure. This period is known as one of the eras in which sexuality was most harshly associated with sin. However, it was also one of the periods when brothels were most widespread and openly present in European cities. This contradiction clearly reveals the dual nature of medieval society's approach to sexuality. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christianity legitimized sexuality primarily for the purpose of reproduction. Extramarital sex was considered sinful, and the female body, in particular, was described as seductive and dangerous. Nevertheless, church authorities acknowledged that completely eliminating brothels was impossible. St. Augustine's famous statement summarizes this understanding: if brothels were removed from society, greater moral chaos might ensue. This approach created a balance where brothels were seen as morally wrong but socially necessary. Therefore, brothels in medieval cities were generally regulated rather than banned. In many cities, brothels were municipal property or operated with the permission of the city council. This situation shows that brothels were not entirely illegal; on the contrary, they operated with the knowledge and control of local authorities. Cities collected taxes from brothels, determined their operating hours, and regulated who could work in these establishments. The spatial location of brothels reflected medieval morality. These structures were often located outside the city walls, in harbor areas, on the edges of marketplaces, or in specific red quarters. Thus, brothels were kept within society but far from its center. This spatial exclusion was a way of symbolically removing sexuality from the public sphere. Women working in medieval brothels belonged to the lowest strata of society. Many were driven to this work by poverty, wars, orphanhood, or exclusion from their families. They had extremely limited legal rights. Violence against them often went unpunished, but they were severely punished for disturbing public order. This shows that brothel workers were both indispensable and unprotected. Even the women's clothing was regulated. In many cities, brothel workers were required to wear specific colors, not cover their hair, or carry distinctive markings. These practices ensured their easy identification and stigmatization within society, thus visually defining the boundary between them and respectable women. In the Middle Ages, the concept of brothels was shaped not only by women but also by masculinity and military order. Soldiers, single men, and sailors who had been in the city for a long time were the main customers of brothels. Authorities believed that the uncontrolled sexual behavior of these groups could lead to rape, rebellion, and social unrest. Therefore, brothels were paradoxically seen as institutions that maintained order. Health considerations also played a significant role in medieval brothel policies. Although sexually transmitted diseases were not fully understood, some cities prohibited women considered diseased from working. These practices are considered primitive precursors to modern medical supervision. However, these controls often focused on women, with male customers bearing no responsibility. The relationship between brothels and the religious calendar is also noteworthy. In some cities, brothels were required to close on holy days and religious holidays. This practice aimed to separate the sacred from the profane by suspending sexuality at certain times. However, the extent to which these prohibitions were enforced was always unclear. Medieval brothels were also centers of gossip, fear, and moral panic. During plague epidemics, brothels were frequently blamed. These places were seen as the source of disease and moral decay. However, when the epidemics ended, the brothels reopened, and the same cycle repeated itself. This shows how undesirable but indispensable institutions brothels were for society. There are also records of brothel workers forming solidarity networks among themselves in some medieval cities. These women were able to gain some degree of economic independence, and in some cases, save money. However, these exceptions do not change the overall picture. Brothels were often a dead end for women in the Middle Ages. This detailed picture shows that the medieval understanding of brothels was not simply a story of immorality. On the contrary, this understanding is a product of a complex system where religion, state, economy, and gender roles are intertwined. Brothels are concrete examples of how medieval society attempted to govern sexuality not by suppressing it, but by restricting it. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, the perception of brothels underwent a significant transformation due to both political and religious shifts. The 14th and 15th centuries in Europe are defined not only by plague epidemics, famines, and wars, but also by crises of authority. These crises directly affected the approach to brothels. Previously tolerated as a necessary evil, these institutions became the focus of increasingly heated debates. The growth of cities, the increase in trade, and the rise of the bourgeois class began to change the public perception of sexuality. The newly emerging urban classes viewed morality not only as a religious matter but also as the foundation of social order. This situation began to question the visibility and legitimacy of brothels. Brothels were no longer considered merely sinful, but also as elements that damaged the city's image. During this period, criticism of brothels came not only from the church but also from secular authorities. City councils prepared reports claiming that brothels increased crime rates, led young men to idleness, and weakened the family institution. These reports show that brothels were no longer seen as institutions to be regulated, but rather as institutions to be eliminated if possible. The Reformation movements created the most drastic break in the understanding of brothels. Protestant reformers described brothels as structures that invoked God's wrath. Martin Luther and the thinkers who followed him presented the existence of brothels as evidence of the moral decay of Christian society. This view led to the rapid closure of brothels, especially in Northern Europe. However, these closures did not mean the complete disappearance of brothels, they only led to them becoming more secretive and unregulated. In the Catholic world, the approach was more complex. While Counter-Reformation movements advocated for strengthening moral discipline, they hesitated to completely ban brothels. Instead, stricter controls, harsher rules, and harsher penalties were introduced. This further worsened the living conditions of brothel workers. Women who were once under municipal protection gradually lost their legal protections. In the late Middle Ages, the economic role of brothels also began to change. These institutions, which had contributed to city budgets in previous centuries, were now seen as a financial burden. Healthcare costs, pandemic fears, and increased security measures made the economic usefulness of brothels questionable. Thus, brothels were stigmatized as institutions that were indefensible both morally and economically. During this period, the social perception of brothel workers also hardened. These women, previously seen as sinful but necessary, were increasingly presented as dangerous, contagious, and corrupting society. This perception is also linked to witch hunts. In some regions, there are records of brothel workers being accused of witchcraft and collaborating with the devil. Thus, sexuality was framed not only as a moral threat but also as a cosmic one. With the closure of brothels, another of the fundamental contradictions of the Middle Ages became visible. As society tried to suppress sexuality, uncontrolled and unregistered forms proliferated. Cases of rape, clandestine relationships, and violence increased. This revealed that the elimination of brothels did not bring about the expected moral improvement. However, this fact was not openly acknowledged for a long time. The end of the Middle Ages can also be considered the threshold at which the concept of brothels evolved into the modern era. Sexuality was no longer seen solely as a religious matter, but as an area that the state needed to regulate. This perspective laid the groundwork for the early modern period's treatment of prostitution in the context of crime, disease, and public order. This transformation turned brothels from semi-legitimate institutions of the Middle Ages into problematic and constantly debated phenomena of the modern age. The issue was no longer just sin, it had become a multifaceted problem encompassing public health, morality, security, and the economy. With the arrival of the early modern period, approximately from the 16th century onwards, the perception of brothels underwent a radical transformation. These institutions, seen as controlled evil throughout the Middle Ages, became increasingly criminalized structures directly intervened in by the state. This change was fundamentally driven by the strengthening of centralized states, the questioning of the absolute authority of the Church, and the growing view of the individual's body as a public matter. During this period, states began to consider protecting the health and morality of the population as a political responsibility. Brothels were no longer defined solely as a source of sin, but also as a source of social decay, disease, and disorder. The rapid spread of sexually transmitted diseases, particularly syphilis, in Europe radically altered the perception of brothels. The origin of the disease was unknown, however, the culprit was clear. Brothels and the women who worked in them became symbolic carriers of the disease. The syphilis epidemic played a decisive role in the hardening of brothel policies. Brothels were closed in many cities, and completely banned in some regions. However, these bans did not eliminate sexuality, they only rendered it invisible. Informal prostitution increased, control mechanisms weakened, and the situation of women became even more vulnerable. This process revealed the ambivalent attitude of states, oscillating between prohibition and regulation. The criminalization of brothels in the early modern period is clearly visible in legal texts. Prostitution was increasingly defined as a legal crime rather than a moral sin. However, this definition of crime was often one-sided. While women were punished, male clients largely went unpunished. This is an early example of how the modern legal system reproduces gender inequality. During this period, the understanding of brothels also began to show a class-based segregation. While the aristocracy and bourgeoisie conducted their sexual relations in private, secret, and protected ways, the sexuality of the poor classes was subjected to public control. Brothels were labeled as places of poverty and moral deviance. Thus, sexuality became a tool of class control. In the early modern era, the female body became an area that the state tried to discipline. The rules governing where and how women could live, dress, and what relationships they could form became increasingly detailed. Brothel workers were the group most severely subjected to these disciplinary policies. Mandatory examinations, exiles, and imprisonment became commonplace. These practices can be considered early examples of modern biopolitics. During the same period, moral reforms also shaped the understanding of brothels. Puritan movements offered a worldview that aimed to suppress sexuality almost entirely. This view was particularly influential in England and Northern Europe. Brothels were closed, and prostitution was met with severe penalties. However, this repressive approach, instead of eliminating sexuality, drove it towards more traumatic and clandestine forms. By the end of the early modern period, the understanding of brothels had clearly changed. The semi-accepted, regulated institutions of the Middle Ages had given way to the problematic, criminal, and constantly debated phenomena of the modern age. Brothels were no longer perceived as structures that maintained social order, but as structures that threatened social order. This transformation paved the way for different approaches to prostitution in the modern era, ranging from complete prohibition and strict regulation to controlled and permitted legality. These debates would deepen further in the 18th and 19th centuries, with brothels becoming one of the arenas where the modern state tested its concepts of morality, health, and freedom. The industrialization that swept through Europe and then America from the late 19th century onwards was one of the most significant turning points that fundamentally transformed the concept of brothels. The transition from rural to urban life reshaped not only economic relations but also perceptions of the human body, morality, and sexuality. During this period, brothels began to be seen not as remnants of feudal or religious order, but as an inevitable byproduct of modern urban life. The Industrial Revolution drew large masses to city centers. Cities rapidly growing around factories, ports, and mines faced housing crises, poverty, and social disintegration. The increase in the number of single male workers, the weakening of family structures, and the high concentration of immigrant populations paved the way for the resurgence of brothels. However, this time, brothels emerged not as semi-legitimate institutions like in the Middle Ages, but as structures subject to the strict control of the modern state. In the 19th century, many European countries chose the path of regulation rather than completely banning brothels. This approach reflects the pragmatic mindset of the modern state. It was accepted that prostitution could not be eradicated, but it was thought that it could be controlled. Thus, the state-controlled brothel system was born. In this system, brothels were licensed, working women were registered, and they were subjected to regular health checks. This regulatory approach became institutionalized, especially in France. Throughout the 19th century, Paris became one of the cities with the most systematic network of brothels in Europe. Brothels were classified: luxury establishments, venues catering to the middle class, and brothels for the poor were clearly separated. This shows that sexuality had also become a class-based commodity. However, this system was built on serious inequality. Health checks only covered women, male customers were not subjected to any control. The female body was seen as both a carrier and a potential threat to public health. This understanding reveals how deep gender biases are, despite the claim of neutrality in modern medicine. In industrial society, brothels were also at the center of moral debates. On the one hand, brothels were seen as necessary in the name of protecting the family and marriage. On the other hand, these places were condemned as symbols of the moral decay of modern cities. This dual approach is clearly visible in the literature, art, and press of the period. The brothel was represented both as a hidden center of attraction and as a source of social shame. From the mid-19th century onwards, criticisms of brothels gained a new dimension. Feminist movements defined the brothel system as the institutionalized form of women's exploitation. These criticisms were based not only on moral grounds but also on political ones. It was argued that this system, built on women's bodies, contradicted modern ideals of freedom and equality. The abolition of slavery and the strengthening of the human rights discourse during the same period also affected the understanding of brothels. The discourse of white slave trade emerged. The claim that brothels were centers for forced labor caused a great stir in public opinion. This discourse, while making real forms of exploitation visible, also fueled moral panic, paving the way for more repressive policies. Towards the end of the 19th century, the regulatory system began to be questioned in many countries. While some states closed brothels, others tightened control even further. These debates reflect the fundamental contradiction of the modern age, the tension between individual freedom and social order. Brothels became one of the most concrete manifestations of this tension. During this period, the concept of brothels began to be examined not only through the lens of sexuality, but also through the lens of labor, migration, poverty, and urbanization. Brothels were a mirror of the structural problems that modern society could not solve. As long as poverty did not disappear, women's economic options did not expand, and the hypocritical moral understanding of sexuality did not change, brothels would continue to exist. The post-industrial revolution brothel system went down in history as one of the institutions that most clearly revealed the contradictions of the modern world. This system could neither be completely suppressed nor fully legitimized. Its ambivalent nature made brothels one of the most controversial phenomena of the modern age. The 20th century was one of the periods in which the concept of brothels underwent its most drastic ruptures. This century was shaped by 2 world wars, mass destruction, ideological regimes, and the rise of human rights discourse. Brothels were at the very heart of these major transformations. The issue was no longer just morality or health, it was the state's authority over the individual, the use of the body in wartime, and the contradictions of modern society. During World War I, brothels became part of military discipline. Many states believed that if the sexual needs of soldiers were not controlled, cases of rape, desertion, and disciplinary problems would increase. Therefore, state-controlled brothels were established behind the front lines and in military zones. Women were often drawn into this system not voluntarily, but due to economic necessity or coercion. This represents a period in which brothels were for the first time openly intertwined with state policy. In the post-war period, brothels were associated with both health crises and discourses of moral decay. Sexually transmitted diseases were seen as one of the invisible legacies of war. States took on the fight against these diseases as a national duty. However, the practices were largely concentrated on women. Mandatory examinations, profiling, and confinement became widespread. Men, meanwhile, continued to be the unquestioned party in the system. World War II took the concept of brothels to an even darker point. Some totalitarian regimes openly used brothels as a tool of control and exploitation. Military brothels were systematically established in occupied territories. What happened during this period is considered one of the most traumatic pages in the history of brothels. After the war, these experiences were not discussed for a long time. Policies of shame, silence, and repression came into play. The Cold War period that followed the wars turned the concept of brothels into an ideological issue. Capitalist and socialist blocs developed different discourses on sexuality and prostitution. Socialist regimes officially banned brothels, defining them as a product of bourgeois immorality. However, these bans did not mean that prostitution completely disappeared, they only caused it to go underground. In capitalist countries, brothels were either strictly regulated or continued to exist through a policy of ignoring them. From the mid-19th century onwards, the strengthening of human rights discourse reopened the debate on brothels. Women's movements addressed brothels not only as a moral issue but also as a consequence of structural inequalities. This approach argued that prostitution was a product of economic and social conditions rather than individual choice. Thus, the debate on brothels shifted from a moral standpoint to a political and sociological one. 2 main approaches emerged during this period. The first advocated for the complete prohibition of brothels. According to this view, brothels were an institutionalized form of female exploitation and should be eliminated. The second approach proposed a regulatory and rights-based model. According to this model, if brothels were to continue to exist, the rights of workers should be protected, and health and safety conditions should be improved. The tension between these two approaches formed the basis of debates that continue to this day. Towards the end of the 19th century, the concept of brothels became a global issue. Migration, tourism, and global inequalities brought prostitution to the forefront as an international problem. While some countries legalized and regulated brothels, others opted for strict bans. These different models show that the concept of brothels does not follow a single evolutionary line. Each society redefines this issue within its own historical and cultural context. At this point, brothels have become a mirror of the modern world. Poverty, migration, gender inequality, and moral hypocrisy are clearly visible in this mirror. The history of brothels is not only a history of sexuality, but also of power, control, and inequality. By the 21st century, the concept of brothels had become more fragmented and controversial than ever before in history. Brothels were no longer a phenomenon that could be reduced to a single definition or model. While they operated legally and under state control in some countries, they were completely banned in others. In some places, they existed in legally undefined gray areas. This diversity clearly reflects the cultural, economic, and ideological differences of the modern world. Digitalization has been one of the most important factors radically transforming the understanding of brothels. With the spread of the Internet, traditional physical brothels have been partially replaced by online platforms, intermediaries, and individual networks. This transformation has led to sexuality becoming independent of space. It has transformed the concept of a brothel from merely a building or neighborhood into a more abstract structure. However, this invisibility has also made control and protection more difficult. In the 21st century, states' approaches to brothels are largely shaped by human rights discourse. In many countries, the central question of the debate is, are brothels and prostitution an individual choice or a structural necessity? This question is being asked in such an open and political way for the first time in history. The answers, however, vary greatly from society to society. Some countries have aimed to legalize brothels in order to secure the rights of workers. This approach defines brothels as a labor space. Health insurance, social rights, and legal protection are fundamental elements of this model. According to this understanding, the problem is not the existence of the brothel, but the insecure and unregulated conditions. Historically, this approach can also be interpreted as a modern continuation of the medieval idea of regulated evil. In contrast, some countries continue to completely ban brothels and prostitution. This approach defines brothels as structures that violate human dignity. In particular, some women's movements argue that the existence of brothels reproduces gender inequality. According to this view, brothels conceal economic and social pressures under the guise of individual choice. This perspective forms the ideological basis of anti-brothel policies in the modern era. Another element that complicates the understanding of brothels in the 21st century is global inequality. Poverty, wars, and migration movements have caused brothel systems to acquire an international dimension. Brothels are no longer just local problems, they are multi-layered, transnational, and political issues. For the first time in history, this situation has transformed the debate about brothels into a global problem of morality and justice. The growth of the tourism sector has also affected the perception of brothels. In some regions, brothels have become an economic attraction, albeit implicitly. This situation reveals how modern capitalism commodifies sexuality. Brothels continue to exist as one of the most controversial examples of this commodification. Today, brothels are not only a legal or moral issue, they are also a field of psychological and sociological debate. Research shows that the experiences of brothel workers are extremely heterogeneous. While some see this field as a temporary economic solution, others experience serious trauma. This diversity reveals the inadequacy of uniform narratives about brothels. In modern society, brothels are also heavily represented in the media and popular culture. Television series, films, and documentaries sometimes romanticize brothels, and sometimes portray them as dark and exploitative places. These representations fuel society's conflicting feelings about brothels. This tension between historical reality and cultural imagery explains why the understanding of brothels remains an unresolved issue. In the 20th century, debates about brothels focused on the balance between individual freedom and social responsibility. Is the state's duty to protect the individual, or to refrain from interfering in the individual's choices? This question is sharply raised in the matter of brothels. Throughout history, the answers to this question have changed, but the question itself has never disappeared. Looking back from today, the history of brothels should be seen not as a dark footnote in human history, but as a central narrative. Brothels are spaces where society's ideas about sexuality, the body, morality, and power are concretized. While there are formal differences between brothels pushed outside the city walls in the Middle Ages and those that have become invisible in the digital age, the fundamental issues remain largely the same. A philosophical examination of the history of brothels reveals that this phenomenon is not solely about sexuality or morality, it lies at the heart of humanity's relationship with freedom, power, the body, and the world of values. Throughout history, brothels have been a space where societies have concealed, suppressed, or attempted to manage their own contradictions. Therefore, the issue of brothels should be addressed as an intellectual problem before moral judgments. From a moral philosophy perspective, brothels are the institutionalized form of forbidden but perpetuated behaviors. Societies have often attempted to bridge the gap between ideals and reality through brothels. On the one hand, marriage, fidelity, and virtue have been glorified. On the other hand, desires that do not conform to these ideals have been directed towards brothels. This situation has led to brothels becoming symbols of moral hypocrisy. This contradiction is particularly evident in Western thought. From antiquity onwards, philosophers have defined sexuality as both a natural and a dangerous force. In the Middle Ages, this idea merged with the concept of sin, and in the modern age, it has been reshaped by the discourse of discipline and control. Brothels have persisted throughout every stage of these intellectual transformations, only their meaning has changed. The concept of freedom is central to discussions about brothels. Does an individual have the right to use their own body? Does this right lose its validity under economic necessities? Throughout history, these questions have never been answered definitively. Brothels are the spaces where the gray area between free will and necessity is most visible. Therefore, discussions about brothels are stuck between the defense of individual freedom and structural critiques. From the perspective of power relations, brothels are institutions that concretize the state's control over the body. Registration, health examinations, spatial limitations, and legal definitions are all tools for transforming the body into a public object. Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics offers an important framework for understanding the history of brothels. Brothels are one of the areas where the modern state's preservation and regulation strategy is most clearly seen. From a gender perspective, the history of brothels is the history of the female body. The existence of brothels has often been directly linked to the limited economic options available to women. Throughout history, male desire has been coded as natural, while female desire has been coded as dangerous. This asymmetrical perception explains why brothel systems have almost always been built around women. At this point, brothels are seen as both the product and the perpetuator of the patriarchal order. The female body has been transformed into both the object of desire and a figure bearing the burden of society's sin. This situation has made brothel workers both visible and marginalized throughout history. Brothels are spaces for a reality that society needs but does not want to accept. The understanding of brothels is also closely related to economic thought. With the development of the capitalist system, sexuality has also been commodified. Brothels are one of the most blatant examples of this commodification. Labor, body, and time are directly transformed into exchange value in brothels. This shows how the modern economy fragments the human experience. Culturally, brothels are spaces that reflect the subconscious of societies. In art, literature, and cinema, brothels are often depicted as spaces where boundaries are crossed and norms are suspended. These representations show that brothels are not only physical but also symbolic spaces. The brothel is often the stage for desires suppressed by society. Looking at it within a historical continuum, brothels have survived by changing form. This line, extending from the temple prostitution of antiquity to the municipal brothels of the Middle Ages, from the controlled houses of industrial society to the invisible networks of the digital age, shows that human desires and social order evolve together. Brothels have not disappeared, they have only changed masks. Projections for the future also confirm this continuity. Technologies such as digitalization, artificial intelligence, and virtual reality may further distance the understanding of brothels from physical space. However, historical experience shows that although forms change, fundamental questions remain the same. The tension between desire, freedom, inequality, and power persists. In conclusion, the history of brothels is not a narrative standing on the sidelines of human history. On the contrary, it is at the center of issues that societies avoid confronting. Brothels are rare institutions that simultaneously demonstrate the limits of morality, the power of the state, the ruthlessness of the economy, and the fragility of the individual. Therefore, understanding the history of brothels is not only about learning about the past, but also about questioning the present and the future. Although talking about brothels is difficult, silence has never solved any problem throughout history. Humanity has progressed not by suppressing its desires, but by giving them meaning. A holistic view of the history of brothels reveals that their emergence or disappearance has never been determined solely by moral choices. On the contrary, brothels have always been directly linked to economic necessities, demographic pressures, wars, migration movements, and the regulatory capacity of states. Therefore, the history of brothels is less a history of morality and more a history of how societies cope with crises. Historical records show that brothels become most visible during periods of social uncertainty. Wars, epidemics, rapid urbanization, and economic collapses coincide with periods when brothels proliferated or were reorganized. This suggests that brothels are not the cause but the result. In other words, brothels are not the source of social problems, but rather areas where these problems surface. The approach of states to brothels should also be read in this context. Prohibition policies were generally justified by moral discourses, however, they were often implemented out of concern for security, health, and public order. Regulatory policies offered practical solutions but deepened inequalities. Throughout history, no model has been able to completely resolve the issue of brothels. This reveals the structural nature of the problem. One of the most enduring aspects of brothel history is silence. The voices of the people working in these establishments have largely gone unrecorded for centuries. Archives are mostly filled with laws, police reports, moralistic texts, and doctors' reports. However, the experiences, fears, and survival strategies of brothel workers themselves have rarely found a place in historical accounts. This deficiency explains why brothel history remains an incomplete narrative. In the modern era, this silence has been partially broken. Social sciences have begun to read brothel history not only through institutions but also through individuals. This approach treats brothel workers not as passive victims or romanticized figures, but as people who made decisions within historical contexts. This perspective gives brothel history a more humane and complex dimension. From an ethical point of view, the brothel issue reflects the tension between harm reduction and principled opposition. One approach aims to minimize harm by acknowledging the existence of brothels. Another approach argues that the very existence of these institutions is unacceptable. History shows that both approaches have become dominant in different periods. However, this dilemma has never completely disappeared. Looking to the future, there is no historical indication that the concept of brothels will completely disappear. However, a transformation is inevitable. Physical spaces are being replaced by digital platforms, mediated networks, and cross-border structures. This transformation makes control and protection mechanisms more complex. Historical experience shows that new technologies, instead of eliminating old problems, reproduce them in new forms. However, future discussions about brothels are conducted through more data, greater visibility, and stronger ethical frameworks, unlike the past. Concepts such as human rights, labor law, and gender equality have moved the brothel issue from merely a matter of whether or not it should exist, to a question of how it should be addressed. This change shows that the history of brothels is not a static but a living narrative. Throughout history, brothels have been a demonstration of society's courage to confront their own dark sides. When this confrontation is delayed, problems deepen; when discussed, they at least become visible. The history of brothels is therefore a history of oscillation between silence and confrontation. Ultimately, brothels are spaces of the unending bargaining between humanity's desires and values. They have been neither fully accepted nor fully eradicated. This state of being caught between two worlds makes brothels historically unique. They are silent witnesses to societies continuing to contradict themselves. The historical continuity of brothels is not only a history of the phenomenon of sexuality, but also a history of how power controls the body. States, religious authorities, and local governments have often viewed brothels as boundaries drawn around desires they could not directly control. Therefore, brothels became less spaces of freedom and more spaces where control was intensified. Taxation, registration, health checks, and spatial restrictions became tools of this control. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, brothels became an invisible but indispensable part of the infrastructure of cities. The concentration of brothels in port cities, centers on trade routes, and areas with military garrisons is no coincidence. These areas are places with high transient populations, weak family structures, and loosened social control. Brothels filled these voids and simultaneously became symbols of these voids. In this process, brothels represented one of the most vulnerable forms of female labor. Historical records show that a large proportion of brothel workers were driven into these spaces by factors such as poverty, war, family breakdown, and migration. However, this does not render them entirely powerless figures. Many historical examples show that brothel workers formed solidarity networks among themselves, established specific rules, and even negotiated with local authorities. This demonstrates that the history of brothels cannot be explained by a one-dimensional narrative of victimhood. The approach of religious institutions to brothels has also varied over time. In the medieval Christian world, brothels were theoretically seen as places of sin; however, in practice, they were tolerated as a necessity that prevented greater sins. This contradictory stance is clearly felt in church texts and sermons. While prostitution was condemned on the one hand, its regulation was advocated on the other. This dual approach reflects the tension between moral ideals and social reality. In the Islamic world, the understanding of brothels has been more covert and fragmented. Although officially banned, they continued to exist indirectly in large cities. This created areas where the state avoided overt regulation but effectively tolerated their existence. These kinds of covert systems show that brothels throughout history cannot be explained solely by the categories of legal or illegal. With the modern era, the perception of brothels began to take on a medical framework. The spread of syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases, in particular, made brothels a public health issue. During this period, brothels were seen as both a source of disease and a control point. Doctors, police, and administrators preferred monitoring brothels rather than closing them. This approach can be considered one of the early examples of modern biopolitics. After the Industrial Revolution, the understanding of brothels was reshaped. Migration from rural areas to cities, the decrease in the cost of female labor, and the deepening of class differences increased the number and variety of brothels. At the same time, moral reform movements gained strength, and anti-brothel campaigns became widespread. During this period, brothels were seen not only as symbols of individual sin but also as symbols of the inequalities created by the capitalist system. The end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century witnessed one of the most severe ruptures in the history of brothels. Women's movements have defined brothels as instruments of the systematic exploitation of women, criticizing the state's regulation of these institutions as a legitimizing step. These criticisms have added a new ethical dimension to the history of brothels. The issue is no longer just about order and health, it's about rights, consent, and power relations. During this period, brothels also played a role in the identity construction of nation-states. The ideal of a moral society has been associated with closing or driving brothels underground. However, these policies have often not yielded the desired results. Brothels have become invisible, but they have not disappeared. History has repeatedly shown that repressed phenomena do not disappear, they only change form. One of the most striking aspects of the history of brothels is their traces in language. Concepts such as red lighthouse, forbidden zone, and fallen woman show how the perception of brothels has become ingrained in the social subconscious. This language is not only a means of definition but also a mechanism of stigmatization. The history of brothels reveals how this stigmatization is produced and passed down from generation to generation. Looking back today, brothels can no longer be seen as merely a moral deviance or a simple economic activity. They have been structures that emerged during times of societal crisis, fueled by contradictions and never fully resolved. Understanding the history of brothels means understanding how societies drew their own boundaries, how they violated those boundaries, and then how they legitimized those violations. This narrative, as it unfolds, reveals the following: brothels are not on the periphery of history, but at its very center. Because the history of humanity is not only the history of ideals, but also the history of the failures of those ideals. Brothels are one of the most visible records of these failures. For more informative videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.